On behalf of the Riggert family, I welcome you, and we appreciate that you're attending today. Although Steve wanted a celebration, please know that crying and tears are permissible. There's so many faces that I've met today, some new faces, people I haven't met, as people unfamiliar. It's great to meet you because you and all of us, we each knew Steve, and Steve knew some very interesting people. So it's great to meet you. My name is Edward Davidson, and I met Steve, the scientist psychologist, Steve the husband. We met in September of 1985 at MD Anderson, where we were postdoc fellows. And my immediate experience with Steve, just in the first few weeks of knowing him, although I didn't know this, the word at the time, my experience was love. And quoting St. Thomas Aquinas, to love is to will the good of the other. And that was the foundation of who Steve was with people. In addition to making it a wonderful friendship, Steve was really the ideal therapist. Steve put love into all of his relationships, and I saw him put so much love into what he did in his work with patients. He valued the personhood, and that's what I think all of us experience, how much he valued us as individuals. He would accept whatever the patient said because it was part of them and thus worthy of being understood. He was well respected and loved by the staff and the patients. Steve had what maybe is a characteristic of his hometown. Steve had a genuineness where he expressed his thoughts and feelings in a very open manner. He was smart enough to be cunning, but he wasn't. He was just very open. And the final ideal Steve had was empathy. He would take another's perspective, even those that sometimes people thought, well, they're really not going to be a very good candidate to do work. But in doing so, he would understand needs and feelings, and he would seek to do the will of the good for the other he would love. So with all of Steve's love reflected in us today, again, I welcome you.
Gratefully, Steve and Joan and I had a couple really good conversations over the past year, and as a result of those, I've kind of used those in picking up an opening prayer for us today. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks today for the life of Steve. In this place and in many places of our lives, we ask you to stir into flame our often restless and our feeble hearts. We ask you, in the words of the good Pope Francis, to let us go forth from this place today to really listen to the needs, the desires, the disappointments, the despairs, and the hopes of those around us. Help us to be bearers of hope to the young and companions to the old. Lead us to be open to the future, sharers of love in action. Let us be a people who include the excluded. Keep us afire with the vision, for the vision still has its time. And then we got one more little bit formal prayer from the ritual. Almighty eternal God, hear our prayers for your son Stephen, whom you have called from this life to yourself. Grant him light, happiness, and peace. Let him pass in safety through the gates of death and live forever with all your saints, in the light you promised to Abraham and to all his descendants in faith. Guard him from all harm, and on that great day of resurrection, raise him up with all your saints. Amen. Next, we have a scripture reading that again is very carefully chosen, but it's very important to Stephen and to Joan, and it will be familiar to all. It's from the first, Paul to 1 Corinthians. Be ambitious for the higher gifts, and I'm going to show you a way that is better than any of them. If I have all the eloquence of men or of angels, but speak without love, I am simply a gong booming or a cymbal clashing. If I have the gift of prophecy, understanding all mysteries and knowing everything, and if I have faith in all its fullness to move mountains, but without love, then I am nothing at all. If I give away all that I possess piece by piece, and even if I let them take my body to burn it, but am without love, it will do me no good whatever. Love is always patient, is always kind, is never jealous. Love is never boastful or conceited. It is never rude, never selfish. It does not take offense and is not resentful. Love takes no pleasure in other people's troubles, but delights in the truth. It is always ready to excuse, to trust, to hope, and to endure whatever comes. Love does not come to an end, but if there are gifts of prophecy, the time will come when they must fail. Or the gift of languages, it will not continue forever. And knowledge, this too, the time will come when it must fail. For our knowledge is imperfect, our prophesying imperfect. But once perfection comes, the imperfect will disappear. When I was a child, I used to talk like a child, think like a child, argue like a child. But now I am a man. All childish ways are put behind me. Now we are seeing a dim reflection in a mirror, but then we shall be seeing face to face. The knowledge that I have now is imperfect, but then I shall know as fully as I am known. In short, there are three things that last: faith, hope, love, and the greatest of these is love. I just have a couple words of reflection, and then we will move along. Get the papers in the right order. We're here today because of a life that was very well lived. Those of you that knew Steve as a husband, father, co-worker, therapist, or friend know this. He was Steve, and living with a disease for 2.5 years was just a sidebar of his life. It was important to him that this ceremony include his favorite chapter, Corinthians 13, 1 Corinthians, which I'm told Joan might sometimes hear him saying quietly under his breath in times of disagreement. Love is patient. Love is kind. I hope I got that right. Something like that. In those 2.5 years, Steve and Joan were blessed to have time to talk about what is important in their lives: family, faith, friends. I was invited to their home last Thanksgiving and blessed their union as they renewed their marriage vows of 37 years with the family members who had come, many from far away, for the holiday. It was quite a celebration. Steve greeted me in his tuxedo. That's the first time I remember seeing him, other than at Christmas parties at Bellarmine. Suddenly he was in a tuxedo. And after a round of introductions and visiting, everyone convened to the living room to take their seats, including the 3 dogs who were present, all part of the family. On another visit with Steve and Joan, I introduced them to the spiritual writings of Richard Rohr, a Franciscan friar, a Catholic priest, and a spirituality author. The old teacher in me makes me want to spell Rohr, in case you don't know about him, R-O-H-R, Richard Rohr. The book they enjoyed the most as they began to explore his work was one called Falling Upward, Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life. I've got about 3 sentences. I just want to read to you to give you a sense of what Richard Rohr is like. And Joan doesn't know this, but just this past week I was up with my brother Steve for a little retreat for 24 hours at St. Meinrad. I told him about today, and I'd introduced Steve to Richard Rohr, and he had his copy of this with him. He said, "Well, Clive, what are you going to read?" And I said, "Well, here, let me look at your copy." And he was underlined, the same things we have underlined. It's kind of spooky. So here's just a couple of sentences from Rohr to give you the sense of what he's like. Catholics used to say at the end of their Latin prayers, "Per omnia saecula saeculorum," which loosely translated means through ages of ages or world without end. Somehow deep time orients the psyche, gives ultimate perspective, realigns us, grounds us, and heals us. We belong to a mystery far grander than our little selves and our little time. Great storytellers, great spiritual teachers always knew this. The adepts in all religions are always forgiving, compassionate, and radically inclusive. If you have in fact deepened and grown in wisdom, age, and grace, you are able to be patient, inclusive, and understanding of all the previous stages of your life. In the book, more generally, Rohr asked us to examine our lives. In the first half, he says we create a container or an identity for ourselves. How do I support myself? What makes me significant? We're building a career, a family, a home, paying bills, and building a community of faith and friends, and that's all great and has to happen. But then in the second half of life, we find the contents for that container, what it was meant to hold, our integrity, serving others, growing a faith, learning from failures. And in so doing, we allow ourselves to fall upwards with grace. Some people, by choice or chance, may never move into the second half of life. But I think Steve certainly did. He led a life in service to others, professionally and personally. He was kind. He believed in giving a hand up, not a handout, as he said. He set the bar high for himself, and he encouraged and inspired his family to do the same. He led by example, and he was truly loved. True love, Jesus said, casts out fear. True love is light, overcoming the darkness. And so we find the light, the fire, the candle, very important and so evocative in so many of the great religions of the world. Just think of the coming month when we have Christmas, Hanukkah, and we just had Diwali. All festivals in the various traditions, festivals of light. And so I'm going to say the blessing of light over the candle that was used, I think, at the time of Steve's mother's death. And then Joan and family will come forward to light the candle. So once more, let us pray. Loving God, you are called the light of the world, and in your light we see light. We cosmically measure the immensity of the universe in seemingly endless light years. We intimately and tenderly tell the beloved that they are the light of our lives. The coming festivals of Christmas and Hanukkah celebrate the light penetrating the darkness. The poet Eliot has written, "We thank thee for our little light that is dappled with shadow." When we have built an altar to the invisible light, we may set thereon the little lights for which our bodily vision is made. And so we come forward to rekindle the light and the candle in this ceremony today in commitment, in expectation, and in deep gratitude.
If you know Steve, you know this one thing: words mattered. They mattered more than money and gifts and travel. He would tell his wife, Joan, and the kids, Chris and Anna, "Don't spend money on presents, just write me a letter." And he wrote plenty of letters. It was 2 years ago that he received a Christmas gift from his family that he dearly cherished. It was a homemade gift, a deck of cards, 52, and actually a few more. And on these cards, they wrote him, 52 plus reasons why you are loved. So we're going to take a look at a few of them and listen to a few of them. Ready? Here we go. You are recognized as an honest man of your word for making me the leader that I am today, because you followed through and showed up for the early morning volleyball meetings and the late night practices, because you made me think twice about something I didn't want to do, but you thought it would be good for me, because sometimes you were the only one that got my joke, for your unyielding commitment to measure twice, cut once, and then cut again. For the one time you had to visit the music venue to make sure it was safe for me to go to see a show. Because we don't make snap decisions. Remember, it took us 1.5 years to buy our first king-size bed on a graduate school budget. For when I'm sick and the kitchen is clean and the laundry's washed and folded. For the Riggert ability to mosey. For being Coach Riggert. For being easy to find in a crowd. For your uncanny ability to misplace tools. For proving you can take the kid out of Iowa, but you can't take Iowa out of the kid. Because we hold hands when we argue, but we don't hold hands much anymore because we think alike. For visiting me in Sweden. For confirming the riverboat pirate legacy. And because you always made me laugh. That's beautiful. Okay. Next, we asked some family and friends to share some of their favorite stories and recollections. But if I may, I'd like to start. Once upon a time, well, actually it was exactly Thursday, September 25th, 1986. And on that day, and despite the fact that both Steve and I are kind of uptight rule followers, we decided to skip out of work that afternoon. And we took in a baseball game at the little stadium down the street in Houston, the Houston Astrodome. And we were watching the Houston Astros play the Giants. And there were plenty of other guys there in white shirts and ties. We blended right in. Nobody knew we were skipping work. And this was, remember, in 1986 when guys would wear a white shirt and tie to go to work. And it was the National League West Divisional Playoffs, and we were enjoying some dome foam, which is beer, if you think about it. And I'm sure we had some pretzels or popcorn or things like that. And we were talking about anything and everything because the Astros were playing a very strong game. So it was a good game. Mike Scott, who was the starting pitcher of that game, had very good control, and he was getting some strikeouts. And around the 5th or 6th inning, Steve goes, Ed, I think we're watching a no-hitter. And Steve was the observant one between the two of us, and he was right. We were watching a no-hitter. And by the 7th inning, there were 55,000 of us standing on our feet until the end of the game. Mike Scott won the Cy Young Award that year, and he pitched a 13-strikeout no-hitter. The Astros won their divisional championship. It really was the very best baseball game I've ever seen with the best friend.
Thank you all for joining us. Where's that up? My name is Chris Riggert, and Steve Riggert was my father. Of the many qualities of my dad, the ones which define him to me are his persistence and his love. Once a goal caught my father's attention, he would not rest in his pursuit, and once someone was lucky enough to be the subject of my father's love, he would never let that love escape. He exercised these qualities while wearing many hats as a doctor, teacher, son, brother, husband, coach, advocate, farmer, and so he would claim as a pirate. But I knew him as my father, as the best father that I knew. And I feel almost guilt, as any descendant of a good Iowan would, at how privileged I am to have Steve Riggert as a father. Not because he was the hippest, because he was not. Not because he was the funniest, even though he may argue to the contrary, but because he was the most supportive and most loving man that I knew. He was truly unable to contain his love for my sister, my mother, and me, and he was an example I aim to emulate every day. He'd often tell me that the most important role he had in life was parenting my sister and I. Through his actions, he provided no room for doubt. Through all of the recitals he attended, the family vacations, the hard life lessons, the ups and downs of childhood and maturation, Dad was always there. And when he put his mind to something, he didn't quit. Like his endless pursuit of knowledge in academia, and then his endless pursuit of imparting this knowledge unto my sister and I. We would joke about his major in distributed studies from Iowa State, which in reality was a series of 6 minors and no major. Yet through the years, he earned multiple master's degrees and a PhD, and over his final years, he was watching videos of recorded college courses, and even in death, he donated his body to science. Like the time we embarked on finishing our basement together, which took about 18 months, and at least 10 of those was spent looking for tools. Like when he coached my baseball and basketball teams, I was never much of a sportsman, but my dad was, and he was ready to coach and always willing to play a game of catch or go play basketball at the JCC. Like the time he had a baby boy on September 26, 1989, and a baby girl on January 4th, 1995. He loved my sister and I from the first day, and he never quit. Dad was always supportive of my sister and I in whatever venture we decided to pursue, and even when he was diagnosed with cancer and his mobility was reduced, when we'd talk, he wouldn't ask for anything and he wouldn't complain, but instead would ask to hear about the exciting pursuits of my life. He never ceased in providing his patient, powerful, and unrelenting love. I think he'd rest well knowing that he will be missed, and his strength allows us to move forward with his memory. Thank you all for coming.
I'm Rob. I'm Bob, and Rob known to the family. This is my wife, Marion, 46 years. Excuse me. And has known Steve for 47 years. And together, excuse me, and together, I'm not joking up, but I can't talk, so. Anyway, Marion has known him for 47 years. A special welcome to 3 high school classmates who are here today, Paul, Steve, and Bruce, and we appreciate their coming. They were classmates and they were fellow teammates, and are greatly appreciated along with family and everybody else. This is a celebration of Steve's time with us. And so while it's not necessarily a Catholic tradition and certainly not a Lutheran tradition, if there's any alleluias or amens or go Cyclones or go Steve, welcome to participate. I'm Steve's oldest brother, and Jim is my youngest brother. And I'm, of course, the least of stature of all 3. Steve was 6'7", Jim is 6'8", and I'm just an average 6'4". Once in a while, I would wrestle with Jim and maybe I could win, but that was because I was 7 years older. I really knew enough never to challenge Steve on that, and I didn't. Steve was an avid sports fan and enthusiast, and especially for basketball and baseball, and followed our beloved Iowa State Cyclones through the thick and thin. Seems more thin than thick sometimes, but thus the jersey. Steve would always comment to me on how our teams were, how ISU was doing. I'm an alma mater, as is Chris and Alicia and Bruce and Steve are alma maters of Iowa State as well, so we're well represented here. So Steve would have been thrilled with the success of Iowa State this year, especially with their defeating West Virginia last 3 or 4 weeks ago as a highly rated team. So he would love to have seen that. Our thoughts about Steve, and I've asked Marion to help me read this, so kind of going back and forth, but we put them into headings, and so just trying to give us kind of snapshots of where Steve was coming from. So I'll let Marion read here.
So as far as family, General Douglas MacArthur, portrayed by Gregory Peck in the 1977 movie, said the following while addressing the Army cadets in his farewell speech. But I want you to know that when I cross the river, my last conscious thoughts will be of the Corps, the Corps, the Corps. Well, for Steve, his lifelong mantra and his final conscious thoughts were, my family, my family, my family. As a rather simple example of this, while growing up in a small Midwest town, Eldora, eating in restaurants was something of a big event. When they could order shrimp, that was extra special. Because the problem was they were not farms at that time for shrimp, so they were very expensive. So they'd be on a shrimp count. So if they were lucky, they'd get 3 or 4 shrimp each, and it was really extra special when they might get 5 shrimp. So Steve, remembering that, would always say, along with a number of other things, that his family would always have as many shrimp as they wanted. So we kind of figured that probably Joan, Anna, and Christopher had lots of shrimp. So the takeaway is that Steve, like all of us, really wanted the best for his children and his family and would strive the best he could to give them that. But he delivered so much more to them and to us. He committed himself to being the best father and the best husband in the world for them. And he was. He had endless pride in his children and was always radiant when he was talking of Chris or Anna. One of his favorite phrases was that he married up 38 years ago. And
There.
And that he was fortunate to have the greatest, most beautiful, and an endlessly supportive wife. So for equality, to Steve, we're all equal. It doesn't matter, just period. Everyone is equal. He was never prejudiced, and he did not tolerate those who were. Within 3 weeks of his leaving us, he was seriously considering renting an RV so that he could have his family drive him down to Montgomery, Alabama, to tour the recently completed Legacy Museum and National Memorial for Peace and Justice as a tribute to the struggle of minorities.
Steve was competitive. He was a fierce competitor all of his life, and especially in his final battle with cancer. In high school, he might have appeared to accept defeat, I'm not sure, but the holes in the walls and doors at home said otherwise. He did not like losing. When he crossed the line on the basketball court or any other venue in life, it was always game on. Steve was talking with my oldest son, Justin, who's here at one point a long time ago, and was talking about basketball and the arch rival, which was, as people from Eldora will remember, was Grundy Center. And he mentioned the term grungy center, and my son looked at him and said, did you say grungy center? Steve looked at him and said, yeah, I never thought of that. I would have used it, and he definitely would have. But he was game on. He did not like to lose, period. Intellect. Steve would never flaunt his intelligence and always treated people as equals. When born in 1952, our mother was very concerned that he did not have a cranial soft spot. Our small-town physician was concerned as well until his father-in-law, who was a country doctor, asked him what the problem was. When told, he smiled and said that it was not a problem and that he was going to be a very bright and talented person. Boy, was he right. Among other things, he turned down a full-ride scholarship, U.S. Navy scholarship to Iowa State, and by that, Eldora definitely lost both an admiral and a very capable person. The one point that, in terms of intellect, that Joan told me last night, which I didn't tell her I was going to put in, but that when Steve first met Joan, it was rather interesting. It was in a softball game, or after a softball game, and Steve was introduced to Joan, and then he went off and did something else, and he came back and making some small talk, and he said, Mary, how are things going this evening? Joan looked back and said, well, Mark, things are going real well. Steve said, I'm not Mark. Joan said, I'm not Mary. So that was the end of the conversation, I think, for that evening. The next time they met, Steve was playing softball and had his uniform on and had gloves, and walked up to Joan and kind of patted his glove on her shoulder and said, how are things going? Kind of a real jock thing, and then walked off. So Joan's friend at the time said, he likes you. I'm glad she continued to like him. So.
Okay. So this is just kind of an example of Steve's honesty, and he's had that since he was a very young man. When home in Eldora on one occasion, Steve was kind of sheepish, and he was at home from college, and Bob happened to be there. So Steve sheepishly asked him if he could borrow a couple $100 to pay an attorney, because he really didn't dare tell their mom. And so it seems that he and some friends were out socializing one evening, and while walking down the street, one of his friends slapped the street sign, attracting the attention of an ambitious young constable nearby. The guy came over, and Steve, probably because Steve was the tallest one there and just the biggest target, he basically charged him and alleged that he'd been disturbing the peace. Well, the attorney provided some options to Steve, that would result in a not guilty verdict. But when asked if he wanted to use those options, Steve said no, he couldn't lie, and he would accept the consequences of going further with this. Turns out that attorney had already talked to the DA, and the charges had been dismissed, but the attorney was testing Steve, and just to see what he would say. And I'm not sure, I kind of don't think much of the attorney for doing that, but whatever. I have never known Steve to lie, and neither has Bob. He was always honest. But Bob was saying here that he felt like this incident was kind of a little building block for Steve to help shape who he was.
It was a big building block, and if I'm not mistaken, the perpetrator who actually attacked that sign might be with us today. So. But that's just rumor. That may not be true. Steve was a sailor. He loved sailing. Louisville, of course, doesn't have very many oceans nearby. But I had many conversations with him about wanting to buy a sailboat and roam the high seas with his family. On more than one occasion, he had a specific boat selected and was ready to sign on the dotted line. The biggest problem would have been where he put all his books. He would have loved being he would love to have been in a tropical harbor providing therapy to sailors that had serious sailing addictions. That would have been the perfect place for him. The topic of mischief, well, we really won't go there, but needless to say, Steve was not perfect, though. Steve was a great human being, and he had many qualities, but like all of us, he was not perfect.
So, actually, Steve didn't start out his life in working as a psychologist. He was a teacher for a time, and he loved teaching children. And I can just imagine being a child who had Steve as a teacher. I would have loved it. He was known to go to his students' homes in the evening and help provide encouragement and assisting them in their studies, just so his students would have a better understanding of life and better way in life. It's just another example of his love for others. He loved history and devoured literature with a passion, and would then encourage Jim and Bob to read the small type 700-page book that he had just finished. But Steve was also a student, and he, of course, earned his PhD from U of L along with a master's in business administration. But if he'd had his way, I think I concur with this, I think he'd have enjoyed having been a professional student, along with occasionally sailing with his family.
Steve was frugal. Steve did not spend money carelessly, especially in automobiles. He was given a 1957 Chevrolet from his grandpa, which he squeezed maximum life from. Before its retirement, it had neither a starter or a reverse gear. He would have to find parking spots which were downhill so he could roll start. While teaching and also working at Mutual of Omaha Insurance, he acquired a previously owned Pacer whose best quality, probably and only attribute, was that it had large doors. Another car apparently had a registration issue, and when noticed by a policeman who started following him, he abruptly turned into the first alley and quickly parked beside a garage, as if he lived there. The policeman followed. He didn't buy it. The thing was, our mother was with him. While mortified, underneath, Mom may have been saying and thinking, well, that's my Steve. On the other hand, maybe not. Towards the conclusion, an upbeat occurrence that did happen 3 days after Steve's death is Marion and I were blessed with the arrival of a new grandson, Lucas Stephen Riggert. In closing, Mary and I were able to stand by Joan when Steve left this world. I know at that moment I saw this larger-than-life spirit soar upwards. I offer the following quote by Terry Pritchett, an English author. Do you not know that a man is not dead while his name is still spoken?
So we celebrate, in conclusion, the life that Steve lived.
This was my brother. Steve, we miss you. We love you. We will never forget you.
Well, I'm Jim, and I'm the youngest of the three brothers. Rob said he's 6'4", and Steve was, I said 6'6", usually 6'7", and I'm 6'8", give or take an inch. And I always said if Mom had continued and had maybe one more, we'd have a professional basketball player, and we could have maybe retired earlier, but I guess it didn't happen, so. tribute to Steve, my brother. If Steve were here today, he would want this short and to the point and not to have the focus on him. And I'll do my best to grant his wishes. He was a humble person. Steve, we all missed you. For Anna, you were the best friend your dad learned so much from you and in countless ways. He often commented about your strength and how amazing you are and how you lit up the day by just entering the room. You always made him smile. And for Christopher, your dad was so proud of you in every way. He would beam with just the mention of your name. And for Joan, words simply cannot describe Steve's love and his devotion to you as a husband and his best friend. And for family and friends, we thank you so much today for your presence. Your love and support is deeply felt in your kind words and memories of Steve that you often relate to our family are continuing to be comfort to us. Although Steve would not admit it out loud, his mantra was do what you say and say what you do. When I was going through a very difficult time, a personal challenge in 1991, Steve would tell me, Jim, if you need me, just let me know and I'll be there. Well, I can remember calling him one fall morning in 1991 at 7:30 in the morning. And I said, Steve, I need you. Will you come? Well, I picked him up later that afternoon at the Cedar Rapids Airport. My life was upside down, and Steve instantly dropped everything for me and stayed over a week with me, despite his overwhelming work schedule. Those who knew Steve knew they could count on him too. I was always his little brother, and Steve was my protector. Even the last time we saw him, a few weeks before his death, he was more concerned about my health than his. And when we talked about politics, Steve and I didn't always agree. He'd listen to what I had to say, but somehow at the end of the conversation, Steve would always seem to come out on top, and I'd just leave scratching my head. We never really talked much about God, but I always knew that he loved our Lord. We all knew. When our mother was in her last hours on this earth, Steve was the one that she called on to pray with her. The week before Steve's passing, the servant song was one of the hymns that was sung in our church. And just brought Steve to mind so much for me. And it brought tears to my eyes. Will you let me be your servant? Let me be as Christ to you. Pray that I might have the grace to let me be your servant too. We are pilgrims on a journey. We are brothers on the road. We are here to help each other walk the mile and bear the load. I will hold the Christ-like for you, so in nighttime of your fear, I will hold your hand out to you. I will hold my hand out to you. Speak the peace you long to hear. I will weep when you are weeping. When you laugh, I'll laugh with you. I will share your joy and sorrow till we see this journey through. When we sing to God in heaven, we shall find such harmony, born to all of us we've known together, of Christ's love and agony. Steve, you were a servant of all. and our brother in Christ. Well done, my good and faithful servant.
In case you don't recognize what I'm doing, I am using some deep breathing techniques that Steve showed me in his office when we were working together at the rehab. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Felmuth, and myself, along with others in the that are gathered here, worked with Steve for 20-plus years at Southern Indiana Rehab. I had the privilege of working with him very closely the last 4 years of his career in our outpatient clinic that worked for brain injuries. I want to thank Joan. I was grateful when she asked if anyone at Sir H wanted to speak today, and I, of course, wanted to. And another colleague of ours also wanted some thoughts shared. So I will start with those first, and then follow with mine. These are some thoughts from Dr. Brad Burton, a clinical neuropsychologist that worked with Steve. The practice of clinical psychology is of a quiet sort, without much in the way of public display. By legal definition, the body of work of most clinical psychologists who perform psychotherapy is confidential, secretive, and rarely publicized. The performance of psychotherapy is a subtle art that can be characterized as inducing small ripples in a pond that expand outward in influence and effect. Small, delicate psychological nudges that can fundamentally impact how an individual views themselves, their lives, and the world. The record of a clinical psychologist's work is recorded in the lives of their patients. Dr. Riggert was a clinical psychologist who performed psychotherapy with the individuals and families who had sustained brain injury and represents some of the most psychologically and physically vulnerable people served by the healthcare community. A brain injury is a life-changing experience, to say the least. Dr. Riggert saw thousands of brain-injured patients, but his impact on those patients, the real impact of his life's work, is known only to a few people. I am one of those few. In my clinical role, I saw most of the patients that Dr. Riggert worked with while he was working with them over the last 17 years. I can say that almost invariably, each and every one of his patients viewed him as essential to their recovery. They held him to be their lifeline for recovery. What he did with and for those people, he did quietly, without fanfare, and at the rate of one person at a time. There were no videos, commercials, or public demonstrations. The best outcome for his patients was that they came to a point where they did not need him anymore. I know that he gave his best to every person. I know that his life's work impacted untold individuals and their families in a manner that cannot be adequately explained or represented. His quiet, subtle interventions behind closed doors positively altered the lifelong functional and psychological trajectory of thousands of people. I know that to be true. Eric Erickson, a psychologist who I know Steve respected, said, "Hope is both the earliest and the most indispensable virtue inherent in the state of being alive." Steve helped people move forward in their lives and redefine themselves as people who have survived. He helped them regain hope, and that matters. That matters a lot. His good works do and will last beyond his own lifetime in the lifetime of others. I hold him to be an esteemed colleague whose life's work was meaningful, impactful, and desperately needed by those persons who were fortunate enough to be followed by Dr. Steve. Respectfully, Donald Bradburton, Ph.D., clinical neuropsychologist, colleague of Dr. Steve Riggert. As I told you, my relationship with Steve, in getting ready for this, I asked several people around our clinic, our coworkers, just to get a couple more memories, or sampling of different thoughts and feelings, so that we can focus on those things that had an impact on his coworkers, his Sir H family, while he worked with us in the hospital. Some told me when Steve walked in a room, he had a big presence, like he could almost step on you, and he was like blocking the light with his 6'7" height and stature. And many of us called him the gentle giant. But it wasn't about that height. It was his gentle soul that filled that room. He knew how to listen to us, not just like listening to his patients, but he could find similarities between unlike things, things that were the same in your life as in his. And he took the time to find these things. Even if you were someone who just spoke to him in the hallway, or you stood beside him in the cafeteria line, he tried to develop a connection with all of those around him. When you work with someone with 20 plus years, you do go through a lot of life's experiences: marriage, divorce, births, and deaths. Steve was known to travel anywhere. He would go from Corydon, Indiana to the west side of Louisville in order to be there for his coworkers. One coworker remarked that while Steve never even had met her father, at the funeral home he stopped to ask questions about her dad. Found out he had been an iron worker, and then somehow Steve found a parallel in his life in Iowa. He related his life to ours as well. Basically, he developed personal relationships, engaged in conversations with us that had meaning and significance. He tried to relate to people on all different levels. It didn't matter what you did at the rehab, whether you're the ones that cleaned the bathrooms or signed the paychecks. And that was who Steve was. Steve always believed in the organization he worked for, and he was always managing up. I don't know how many times I heard him say, Jennifer's my boss, and laughed. And it wasn't, I never signed his paychecks. I was not his boss, but he always was bringing a hand up, I think I heard someone say earlier. When he had his knee replacement, he called me and he said, Jennifer, I think I need a few more days. I think I need to be at the rehab. And I said, I think that's probably a good idea, Steve. Now, those of you that work in healthcare, no matter how much you believe in the facility you work in, we tend to not recover where we work. Because let's face it, we don't want our co-workers seeing us in our underwear. But Steve still was admitted a patient there. And in what I call our community room, where our brain injury patients come and eat their lunch, or they're there during the day, one day I looked up and here's Steve coming around the corner, and his hair was all over the place. He looked like a mad scientist. And he just had a hospital gown on, and I really don't know what was underneath it. And he just wanted to, the patients were in there, and he just wanted to say hi to his patients. He wanted to let them know that he was okay and he was going to be back soon to keep on with his work. And that's with this big old smile on his face. And that, I can see him to this day. But that's what I mean. It was about others first. One thing that Steve said that became clear, that he exemplified, was that we will go through changes, but don't let that change you. And he said that at his retirement luncheon at the rehab. At the same time of his retirement, our organization was going through our organizational change. We were being bought by a company, and we didn't really know what was going to happen to a lot of us. But I felt that quote, that mantra, applied to his life. Through his illness and as it progressed, he continued to maintain his professionalism and his work ethic. And really, we just kept working and talking together and talking about patients as if nothing was going on with him. And some days I forgot he was sick. But my job was really just to keep on with it with him and just to make sure he had his lukewarm water and no ice. Steve went above and beyond, it's obvious. And he really knew how general systems worked. And I don't know if it was all that education he had. His bachelor's degree in distributed studies, which, Chris, I did Google and I really couldn't find the answer. So thanks for explaining that. His teaching, his MBA, his PhD. He was an underwriter for insurance policies. He was a social worker. And he was an advocate for those, especially those whose insurance was at risk for being taken away. We saw how he made connections for patients from the hospital to the outside world, and he told me that is always our purpose, Jennifer, so they could generalize, so they could live outside of here without us. We call Steve a practical intellectual, and I think that's what made him real to us, his Sir H family, and we will miss him.
Hi, my name's Paul Piper, and I want to do something before we, this is Steve Dole here.
I have a few comments later.
Okay. Before I start, though, I want you all to just turn around and look at the people in the room. Just take a moment, turn around, look at the people in the room. These are just a few, and I underline the word few, of the people that Steve's life touched. As I said, my name is Paul Piper. When Joan asked me to speak, I felt very honored, and Chris, Anna, Joan, thank you for this opportunity. She asked me to speak representing the boys from Eldora. Just to let you know, most of you knew Steve through your association at work, as family and as friends. My association with Steve goes back about 60-plus years. He and I were what I would consider friends 50 years or so ago. We were both born in a small town, rural town in Iowa called Eldora. We were born in 1952, and the 1950s and 1960s, Eldora had 3,200 people living in it. Our class was a class of 69 people. To give you an idea of what Eldora looks like, being a small town, it happens to be the county seat, so there's a courthouse in the middle of town. And around the four sides of the courthouse, you have all of the businesses in town. You have your hardware stores, your women's clothing, your men's clothing. Riggert's Paint was there, sports shop. All of these were centered around the courthouse. There were also two stoplights, one on each side, that was the highway that went through town, so that when you went through Eldora for the very first time, you were guaranteed you would have to stop at least one of the stoplights so that you could see what the town was like. As I was saying, we were part of the post-war baby boom. We had 69 individuals in our class. I don't think at any time there were more than 75 people in our class. So we were more like an extended family rather than classmates. With all the weird relatives, we were still classmates and relatives. I don't know how it started, but in the summer of 1970, after we had graduated, there was Steve, Don Rose, Bill Teets, Steve Dole, and I, and we got together almost every night. We were often joined by other classmates like Bruce Clark, who's here, and we would either go to Marshalltown or Iowa Falls to a movie, or we would stay in Eldora, sit at the Snow Cream, and shoot the breeze, And our most favorite thing was getting in Don's 1963 Galaxy 500 and cruising. We would go from the Snow Cream through town, through both stoplights, across the big bridge, around the stop sign that was in a barrel, and then back across the big bridge again through the two stop signs and back to the Snow Cream. During the daytime in 1970, most of us worked out in cornfields detasseling corn. Now, for those of you who are uneducated about what corn detasseling is, it is a dirty, stinky, hot, sweaty job. What you do is you go from corn plant to corn plant down an 80-acre field. Now, for the Riggerts, it's down here. For me, it's up here, and you pull the tassel out of the corn. Steve was our crew chief. He was the one that drove the bus. And the funny thing is that we would get together that evening after we had been out all day, and again, be just friends. We also got together during breaks during Thanksgiving and Christmas. And the interesting thing is, when 1971 came along, it found us all back out in the fields again, all riding around in Don's car. And it went on that way from 1970 to 1976. And through those years, members of our groups came and went. Don was drafted into the Army, and the summer of 72 and 73, he was gone, but he was back in 74. Dole, I think you got married in 72, and he left the group. I met someone in 1973, toward the end of the year, but I stayed with the group through 1975. Steve was with that group every summer, all the way through 1976. After 1976, we saw each other very, very infrequently. Soon, it was only at class reunions. But the interesting thing about it was every time we got together, it was like we had been with each other the night before. And then this late August, I got a phone call from Don Rose. Don had been in contact with Joan and with Steve, found out he had pancreatic cancer, had gone through chemotherapy, and wasn't doing real well. And listening to Don, I knew that although we no longer have a 63 Galaxy 500, it was time for a road trip. So I live in Council Bluffs, Iowa, which is on the west side of the state of Iowa. I drove over and picked up Don near Eldora. We stopped and picked up Bill Teets and made our way here to Louisville. When we arrived, Steve and Joan greeted us. And later in the evening, Chris stopped by. We got to see Chris. I hadn't seen him since 1990. Very small at that time. Much bigger now. And the next evening, Anna, you stopped by with your friend. And early on in our visit, Steve, being who he is, explained his illness, his prognosis, and his philosophy of life. He encouraged us to ask him anything we wanted to. And as I recall, we asked him nothing because we knew everything we needed to know. And then it came. Through the days, we had the stories of reminiscing. Pretty soon, we weren't three 66-year-old men sitting there. We were boys back from Eldora. And we drifted in and out of those remembrances for the next 36 hours. In the morning, it came for us to leave. Steve and I got a chance to just sit down together. Or I sat and he kind of lounged the way only Steve could. And I asked him the question he'd asked me, is there anything you want to know about me? And in true Riggert psychologist fashion, he thought there very thoughtfully for a moment, looked at me and said, no, and then said, is there anything else you want to know about me? And I told him likewise, no, because after all, it was real simple. We're friends. When I got ready to do this, I kept on thinking of the movie Stand By Me. I'm going to get through this. That movie, for those of you that don't know about it, it's a first-person account told by an adult who remembers he and 3 of his friends going to find the body of a dead boy. And it talks about their experiences. And this is written as an adult, and he's remembering it. And the reason he's remembering it is because just recently one of his group died. In the last part of that movie, he's on the computer and he types these words. Although I hadn't seen him in more than 10 years, I know I will miss him forever. I never had friends later on like the ones I had when I was 12. Folks, I'm a Christian by faith, and in our faith, we believe that one day the faithful will live again forever in a new sinless, new heaven and new earth. I'm looking forward to that time. I'm sure that I'll see Dole, Teets, Bruce, and Steve, and we'll all be together driving in that 63 Galaxy 500, going on a new adventure in the new Eldora. I end my part of this remembrance of Steve with a slightly different revised version of Stand By Me. Although I didn't see Steve for years at a time, I know I'll miss him forever. I never had friends like the ones I had growing up. Does anyone? Casey.
My name's Steve Dole. I hadn't planned on saying anything, but I got here and heard some of the things said. A couple things came to mind. Maybe they're good things, maybe they're bad things about Steve. But I grew up with Steve, went to high school together, went to college together at Iowa State, played basketball, baseball. As Paul had mentioned, we were a group that ran around together and everything. There were just a couple of stories about Steve that they were kind of strange, but I think we were in high school, and this is just the kind of guy Steve was. We were, I don't know where we were by his house or walking around or something, and there was this little dog that came by. I could have cared less, it was just a dog. But Steve had to pet it. And he bent over, pet this little dog, I don't know, a Pekingese or something, and it promptly bit him in the nose, and now he's had this scar on his nose all his life, right? Another story about Steve, when we were freshmen in college, I think this was winter of 70, 71, and this, Robert mentioned the first car he had. It was a 57 Chevy, green. He'd just gotten it, so it was still running. Now, it was his turn to drive back to Eldora that weekend, and so now Sunday afternoon we're on our way back to Ames. And the car leaked gasoline. I don't know where from. Gas tank leaked or something, but I had to watch the gas gauge. Steve was sure, yeah, we'll make it at least back to Ames, all 50 miles. So we're going along. The other thing that this car didn't have, it didn't have a radio. Of course, there was no CDs, tape players in cars in those days. All you had was a radio. This car had no radio. So what we did for our own entertainment was we basically sang together in the car. At the top of our voices, I can remember singing Chicago's Make Me Smile. That's just kind of the way it was. Anyway, I've heard everything that people have said about Steve, the love, the concern, all of this stuff, what a great guy he was, and yeah, I agree with that. That I knew him through college, 74. It's been 40 years. I've only seen him occasionally in the last 40 years. But I have to agree, to me, he was a good guy, a great friend, and I'll never forget him.
Joan asked me to bring this portion of the memorial to a close, so that's what I'm going to do. So many people mentioned Steve's vast intellect, and I would concur with that. I, on the other hand, Joan's sister and Steve's sister-in-law, didn't have a mind for detail and scientific facts the way Steve did. I was more prone to homespun theories and noticing signs and wonders in the world. So we often had interesting conversations. And when I found out that my homespun theories kind of impressed Steve or made him laugh, I delighted in conjuring up more of them, especially on days when it might have been rough for him with his disease. I remember one day, after wearing one of those great big boots for an Achilles heel, and the boot had come off, but the pain was still there, and Steve would always notice it when I walked. And he would say to me, "How's that heel coming along, Barb?" And one day I caught him by surprise, and I said, "Oh, Steve, I've got the cure for it. Every night I rub Vicks Vapor Rub on the bottom of my heel, and in the morning the pain has subsided." And he gave me one of those looks, and he said, "Barb, you can believe that, but if you do, I've got a bridge I'd like to sell you." Another time I got really excited because I saw a video that talked about the curative properties of mushroom extract on cancer patients. And I excitedly sent that over to him by email. And to his credit, he watched the whole thing. And then he said to me, "You know, after I watched, I couldn't find the credentials on this theorist at all." And he said, "So people may be helped by it, but I'm not going to be one of them." In one of the last conversations I had with Steve, I remember saying to him, "Now, Steve, when you pass, you'll have to get in touch with us to let us know that all is well with you." And it was only about 2 days after he died that I opened up my iPad to play Words with Friends. And if you're not familiar with it, it's an online Scrabble game. And each person uses their letters to make a word and sends it over to the next person, and they do the same. In order to play it, you have to have a user ID. And when I opened up the Scrabble game, up popped Steve's user ID, Cyclone 74. Cyclone for Iowa State and 74 for the year he graduated. And I couldn't believe it. So I punched, and the message came, "You won, Barb. Steve timed out." But this communique was nothing like the way Steve got in touch with his beloved Joan. And you can believe what I'm about to tell you or not, but this is the story that Joan shared with me. 2 weeks after Steve passed, Jim's youngest daughter, Megan, was married to Scott in a ceremony in Davenport, Iowa. And although Joan rarely made a solo drive, a trip of 7 hours or more, she decided to go to Iowa. Somewhere along the way, it dawned on her that the date was October 25th. This was the day of their 38th wedding anniversary. And you know, tears come when tears come, even if you're driving along Interstate 74. And the tears came. And as Joan sobbed, she heard a soft voice that said, "Don't cry, pretty girl." And if you know Steve, that was his term of endearment for her, and he used it often. The words had a calming effect on her, and she knew that she was right where she was supposed to be. Steve would have wanted her to be driving to Iowa to be with his family. After taking a deep breath and regaining her composure, She turned on the radio, and as the volume was turned up, this is what she heard. And I hope you hear it here. You may have recognized that as Billy Joel's "Only the Good Die Young." Besides the words to the song having a special meaning, a Billy Joel concert was the last concert, one of the last ones that Joan and Steve saw together. The next song was no less significant. Every breath you take, every move you make, I'll be watching you. Joan grabbed a pen and she started to write down these songs of happenstance so she could share them with the family when she got to Iowa. And at this point, the announcer broke in and he said, "You've been listening to random hits of 1974. And as the next song began, Joan remembered Steve's user ID, Cyclone 74. And then Olivia Newton-John began to sing. If not for you, babe, the night would see me wide awake. The day would surely have to break. It would not be new if not for you. And lastly, you'll recognize this one. I'm going to miss her for the rest of my life. All I need is a miracle. When Mike and the Mechanics finished their song, it was the end of the tribute to 1974, and the usual hard rock music began to play and continued for the rest of the trip. A few hours later, Joan received a text from Pam, Jim's wife, and Pam asked Joan, "Where were you and Steve married?" Joan told her it was in Pennsylvania because that's where our parents were living in 1980. And Pam responded, "Well, then we got our sign from Steve." You see, Pam and Jim had rented a car from Enterprise in Cedar Rapids to drive to the wedding in Davenport. And when Enterprise picked them up, they found out that there were no cars available, only the van, which they eventually used. And you can guess where the license plate of the van was from, Pennsylvania. Popular writers have proposed 9 signs that loved ones use to communicate with you, and among them are phones that ring only once, pennies that you find that have a significant date on them, dreams, numbers, and music. You may think the events I described to you are a mere coincidence, or you can draw comfort, as we do, that Steve got in touch with us to let us know all is well.
I'm practicing your technique. As I listened to Ed talk about the 52-plus reasons on the cards, I thought maybe I should explain that riverboat pirate. Years ago when Aunt Thelma did the Riggert genealogy. Steve would claim that, and tell us that Riggerts were mostly German, a little bit French, and a dash of riverboat pirate. That was much to his mother's strong rejection of that theory, but he loved to keep that up and tell her that we were indeed part pirate. And he even went so far as to claim that he was related to Captain Fink. So as you can see, Steve loved sailing, and this was taken 23 years ago. And I'd like to think this is chapter 2 of his life, and he has finally met Captain Fink, and he's on his road to the high seas once and for all here. I cannot thank all of you, any of you, every one of you, near and far, relatives, friends. Thank you for being present. Thank you for being here, and we are so blessed to have you in our lives. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much for coming today. Your love is so much in the room. Thank you.